Good afternoon. I'm Dean Leonard Baines. I'm the Dean of the University of Houston Law Center. I've been Dean for 6 years. I'm the first African American Dean of this great institution. It's an institution that has many top ranked programs in health law, intellectual property law, environmental law, tax law, and its part-time program. And we've done really a great job with diversity in a lot of awards we received in terms of the HEAT Award. And we've done have an outstanding pipeline program for students, college students interested in going to law school, where we've placed over 61 of them with over $2 million worth of scholarships at law schools across the country. But even with all those achievements, we recognize we need to do more. The moments that we've seen with respect to the George Floyd death, we realize that there's so much more that we can do. And that's why we have organized this Juneteenth webinar, town hall on racism and the law and what we can do about it. I want to thank the chairs of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, Professor Meredith Duncan, who is the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the Law Center. So Meredith, why don't you say hi? Thank you, Meredith. And the other director of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee is Professor Jeff Hoffman, who is the director of our Immigration Law Clinic. Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for all your hard work here. And I know you will know this is a great program because we went through a trial run a few days ago. So thank you guys. So I want to talk a little bit about what's been going on with respect to these issues. So as I mentioned, we've been rocked by the death of Houston native George Floyd while he's in police custody in Minneapolis. We've also seen the deaths of Breonna Taylor in Louisville and Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, as well as the accusations against an African-American bird watcher in Central Park by a white dog walker. There have been so many unfortunate deaths of African-American men and women while in the custody of the police and as well as under color of law. And what many times before when we've heard about these deaths, these tragic deaths, people often question what may have happened before or after, et cetera. But now with the advent of videotape, we see that sometimes these things actually do happen and they are tragic. These deaths have now been followed by civil unrest in Minneapolis, but all across the world, because a lot of people are saying it's time to stop anti-Black racism, racism generally, but anti-Black racism specifically. And we've seen a multicultural, multiracial movement of people of all backgrounds who come together to sort of say enough is enough. And we've seen people and businesses respond to this. We see that NASCAR eliminated the Confederate flag. We see the NFL has now said Black Lives Matter. We see President Trump says that Colin Kaepernick should be able to play football. We see Senator Mitt Romney marching in the Black Lives Matter demonstration. We see the Oscars, which had been criticized for being Oscars so white, now including diversity and inclusion in their eligibility process. We see the Pentagon changing and thinking about changing the names of Army bases named after Confederate generals. We see Aunt Jemina and Uncle Ben, products that were born in racist times and with racist stereotypes, are now being retired. It feels like we're now in a Me Too movement for race. The world feels like it's changed significantly. So we decided to organize this Juneteenth celebration, this workshop, this webinar on race and racism and what we can do about it in honor of Juneteenth. So Juneteenth took place on June 19th, 1865, when General Gordon Granger, with 2,000 Union troops, occupied Texas, and he announced the Emancipation Proclamation that freed slaves in 1863 applied to Black Texans. It afforded absolute equality of personal rights and transforming the relationship of that of employer and hired laborer. This event, as I mentioned, took place 2 years after President Lincoln first issued the Emancipation Proclamation, making Texas one of the last states, Confederate states, to put the proclamation into effect. Juneteenth has since grown into a Texas and national holiday, now known as Freedom Day. So we really want to talk about these issues. We're going to dig deep with a real all-star panel of our alums, which I'm proud that are all our alums. They're really talented, hard-charging, very smart, very capable alums who happen to be of African American descent. So our first panelist, who I'll introduce, is Kirk Dobbins. Kirk Dobbins is the Vice President and Regional Counsel of Kaiser Permanente for the Northwest region in Portland, Oregon. He has extensive experience in advising clients on a wide range of legal issues and strategy, including insurance laws, the Affordable Care Act, pharmacy law, fraud and abuse, antitrust and privacy. He, of course, earned his JD from UH in law school in 1993. He previously served as Vice President of Compliance Strategy and Implementation at CVS Caremark Corp. He was, before that, a counsel at King and Spalding, Washington, D.C. And he started his career in the General Counsel's Office of the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. And he actually started out going to medical school and realized that law school was a better venue for him. So thank you. Welcome, Kirk Dobbins. Our next panelist is Tiana Sanford. So Tiana Sanford is a prosecutor in Montgomery County, Texas. She's a 2008 graduate from the University of Houston Law Center. She spent 4 years working on officer misconduct cases, including use of force. She became the first Black district court chief prosecutor in Montgomery County when she was appointed to serve on legislative liaison issues, acting consultant to the state lawmakers on criminal justice. She does training for the Texas District and County Attorneys Association, and she has a TED Talk on the power of authenticity. Welcome, Tiana.
Thank you.
Our last panelist is Richard Craig Smith, who has his JD from University of Florida, but his LLM in health law from the University of Houston. He's a partner in Quinn Emanuel's Washington, D.C. office. He earned his LLM in health law from UH in 2000. He has over 25 years of trial experience, including handling over 100 criminal and civil cases in state and federal courts throughout the US. At Quinn, Richard practices in complex litigation, white-collar crime, risk assessment, creation and implementation of anti-corruption practices, corporate internal investigations of public and private companies. He's a former principal deputy chief of litigation of the fraud section of the Department of Justice, Criminal Division. He supervised a number of litigation attorneys there and activities. And for 5 consecutive years, he received the Special Achievement Award, recognizing him for his work at the DOJ. And he's one of the first people to try a Sarbanes-Oxley Oxley Act case, and he's a recipient of the UH Law Center's Dean's Award. So welcome to my all-star panel.
Thank you.
So the way we're going to work this panel is I have a series of questions I'm going to ask the panelists, and they'll all answer briefly. We'll go through the questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I actually have 2 audience questions we'll first start with, and one of our colleagues is keeping track of any audience questions that come along. So the first question, for many of you may not know, I've taught race and law for a number of years at my prior institution, St. John's Law School. And the course was actually comprised of people of all different backgrounds, usually half people of color, half people who are white. And the very first question I asked them, and I'll explain why I'm asking it after the panelists answer it. But the very first question I asked the students in the first day of class is, when did you first know you had a race and what race that was? And I say to them, it's not your ethnicity, it's not your religion, it's not your gender, it's not your sexual orientation. It is, I'm asking specifically, when did you know what your race was, or that you had a race? And so let's start in alphabetical order with Kirk. So Kirk, when did you know you had a race? What was the circumstances?
Thank you, Dean, for that question and also for your opening remarks. I'm glad to be here today. That's a great question. I think I've known from a very early age, with a very close family, growing up just south of Houston, in Galveston and surrounding areas. And I think in early education, as early as kindergarten, um, going off and talking to my parents and being a somewhat precocious child, and being told that you need to conduct yourself in a certain way. There are other students there, or little children there, little white boys and girls, but you have to be a very good boy, because you don't get the same benefit as they all do. And so my parents explained that to me in a way that I could understand at that point in time. But I also realized as I progressed through elementary school that, I had to make sure that I conducted myself in a certain way. And teachers, when they looked at, my black and brown classmates, it was a little different. So I realized at a very early age. But I think also just with family, just interacting with my family, talking about holidays and just family history too. Realized that I was African American, I'm black, um, and we have to think about things in a slightly different way than others who are not black.
Thank you, Kirk. Tiana.
So I spent a lot of time thinking about this question because I cannot recall a time that I did not know that I was Black. And then I went the step further because the first experiences of me being acutely aware that I was Black are negative experiences, right? And so I said, Tiana, you knew you were Black before a negative experience. How did you know that? And I think for me, one of the earliest memories I have is in spaces with my cousin, who I love, who's like a sister to me, and she is biracial. And so there was automatically something that I knew we are different in some way, right? And so I recognized it there. I navigated many predominantly white spaces in my life. And then the spaces that my parents intentionally placed me in, whether it was our church community, which is predominantly Black, or being at family events, but I always felt the difference in those spaces. So school, predominantly white, church, predominantly Black, family, predominantly Black, experiences with family, that non-negative, I think it was probably realizing that me and my big cousin, who I look up to and I love, we were different.
Great, thank you. Richard Craig.
For me, I've always known I was African American or Black. Being born in Atlanta, Georgia, growing up in Atlanta, the schools I went to in my early years were predominantly Black, so it really didn't make a difference. It wasn't until my father passed and we moved from Atlanta to Talladega, Alabama, that I really understood what it meant to be Black. Because when we moved to the state of Alabama, for the first time I was being bused to a majority school, and it became quite abundant that we were not wanted at the school. There were a number of riots that occurred when I was in middle school, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And it wasn't until my senior year in high school that we elected an African-American homecoming queen and a Caucasian homecoming king, both two of the most popular students in the high school, in order so there would be peace and not be riots at the, homecoming game. So it became very apparent that when you're being bused across town, others made sure you knew that you were not wanted or welcome in their neighborhoods. And in fact, when we started participating in sports, that helped the integration process in the school system. But if you missed the bus home from school, either your classmates would take you to your side of the track so you wouldn't have trouble, or you had a long walk home from the white neighborhood to the African-American side of town.
Thank you, Richard Craig. So the reason why I asked this question is in the almost 15 years that I taught this course at St. John's University in New York, invariably the African-American students usually experience their race early in their lives, and others a little bit later, and some whites much, much later. And this is sort of, I guess, the salience of race, right? That, whether it's in Kirk's situation where your family sort of indicates and tells you how you need to comport yourself, or whether it's in Tiana's and Richard Craig Smith, where the space seems like it's rejecting of you, many times young Black boys and girls and teenagers sometimes have these issues that others may not. And that's sort of, I think, the salience of the race, how race is so different and can be so impactful for Black people in particular, but also many students, many people of color, right? That people see that you're different and recognize you're different and make assumptions and stereotypes about you. Let's move on to the next question. So you're all incredibly successful. I mean, a partner at a major litigation firm, winning all these awards, vice president of a major corporation, a leading prosecutor who has a TED Talk. I mean, incredibly successful. So our audience may say, oh my God, they can't possibly face race discrimination now. There could be no barriers put in their place, some people may be saying. So I'd like to ask, have there been any barriers that you've experienced professionally, based on your race, even though you are from everyone's outward appearance, and your resumes, you're incredibly prominent. We're proud to have all of you as our graduates, let me just tell you. Could you describe any of the obstacles that you may have faced and how you overcame them? So Kirk, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Definitely, it's been a journey. The exterior may appear that we've got it made and we haven't had obstacles, but we all know it took a lot of work, a lot of striving. I'll share that when I went off to college, my first year, I was in a dual degree program at a local university at TSU in Rice, and I went there because I couldn't make up my mind. And obviously, that's a historically Black institution, and had a great experience there, did well my first year, and then decided to go off and transfer to another school that was not historically Black. But they had a really strong pre-med program, and it was a stark contrast. And I knew then and there, because I was one of maybe 3% of the population versus coming from TSU and even at Rice, where we're a much higher percentage. And I knew then I had to work really, really hard. Not that there were barriers, but I knew innately that I've got to do incredibly well and I've got to fit in. And fitting in sometimes was awkward, but you do what you have to do well. And you make sure, my father, my mother always told me, you can't settle for getting by. You're Black. You have to do that and then twice as much. So I've always lived by that, worked really, really hard. Fit in as much as you can, but as a Black man, and I think Black women as well, we live in two worlds. Sometimes we're straddling the line. We have to live the way we live at home, talk the way we talk at home. But when we're in school, when we're at work, we have to be a different person. It's called code switching, as we probably all have heard of it.
Yes.
And I did a lot of that to get to where I am. No apologies, no regrets, but it's just the reality of how it is for us.
Great, thank you so much. Tiana.
So, I don't want to be repetitive. I think that what is so significant is how universal these experiences are. So I would say that, no offense, Kirk, we graduated at very different times from U of H, experienced different times in the world, but still being an 80s baby, graduating from law school in 2008, I have had similar experiences. I want probably to focus on the challenges that are less apparent to the naked eye. And that has always made it very clear to me how important community is. I will start by saying there's absolutely no way that I would be sitting where I am today if it was not for an incredible village, an incredible community, right? And they had to be intentional and they had to put in work. And one of the reasons that they had to be intentional and they had to put in work is because they understood that the world was not built for me, right? And so I had parents who were very intentional about placing me, even in the predominantly white spaces that they placed me in, placing me in parochial schools, in a Marianist tradition, where we're gonna hold you accountable to walking the walk that you walk about social justice and valuing everybody and having these conversations. Because I think that the most difficult part, both personally and professionally, has been what is a common term of microaggressions that happened everywhere. right? Those things that happen to us in our spaces that are not explicitly meant to be hurtful or harmful, but reflect what the messenger thinks about you simply because of your race. You know, we don't have much time here today. I would also say that we all are familiar that there's an intersectionality that happens, right? I'm not only Black, but I'm also a woman. And I will tell you that some of the challenging times have been when I am what would be objectively considered as successful. That is when, at times, I feel those microaggressions most intensely. Because there's, at times, and more often than not, a tone of, who does she think she is, right? How dare she navigate these spaces with a sense of agency? How dare she not ask for permission to have an opinion, right? And so those have been the most challenging times. When I think about times in my career where I have felt broken, which honestly, that's not something that people who are not part of my tribe see. It's come from those moments where you are feeling these barriers that you are screaming to people that are there, but they're invisible if people don't have a cultural competency or a perspective to understand what that feels like. And I think about your first question about when's the first time that you had recognized or knew that you were African-American, that you were Black, and a lot of people telling stories about the first time that they encountered racism. And I automatically think, why aren't people asking about the last time? Because you may be surprised that it was in the past week or last year at Thanksgiving leaving the Home Depot, right? We're talking implicit and explicit. So I would say that for me, the most challenging thing has been navigating those microaggressions, but it has really solidified for me the significance and the power of having a tribe and having a community of support and being intentional about who you share your space with.
Can you give an example of the microaggressions? I'm just
Sure.
I don't know what that is.
Yes. So one example is complimenting me on how articulate I am, right? I was captain of the speech and debate team in high school. I did theater, right? My mom read to me, and my dad too, every single night. My vocabulary and the words I knew when I was younger probably have more to do with how articulate I am. But it is, gosh, you're so articulate, right? Also and this is kind of an old school one. If you still got people saying this, we have to work on them. We pray for everybody. But God, you're not like most Black people that I meet. So tell me, why am I not like most Black people? Or, and this was really common going to high school in the 2000s, Tiana's not really Black. I'm more Black than Tiana is, right? Like, oh, really? Tell me how so? Tell me how you're more Black than I am. Let's unpack that, right? So those are examples of microaggressions, the things that reflect more about the speaker and reflect more about how the speaker may globally view a category you belong to, right, than explicitly saying it.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Richard Craig, what barriers have you overcome, or are there any barriers? People would say there's no barriers. Look at him. He's so successful.
I've been very blessed in my career. And I had to learn very early on that not all Caucasians were racist. Not all African Americans couldn't do well in school. And I remember when I was leaving the University of Florida College of Law, a professor who was a Caucasian literally called the DA's office and said, he's a great trial lawyer, you should give him a shot. And I got hired at the DA's office. I went to work for my first boss, who was Jewish, who said, work hard, you do well here. And I eventually got placed in what's called the Repeat Offenders Court. That means I finished county court. I've been in the sexual assault division. But in Repeat Offenders Court was where you tried all the high profile criminal cases of the most violent offenders in the city at the time. And when I walked into the courtroom, the judge asked, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm the prosecutor assigned to this division." So he called me up to the bench and he goes, "Look, I don't want any trifling attitudes here. I don't want you being late for court here, and you never ask for a continuance," which basically filled the stereotypes that most African Americans are trifling, they don't do what needs to be done. And I had a choice to make. I could either get very upset and go upstairs and complain, or I could just go in and do my job. And I chose to do what James says, chapter 1, verse 19, be slow to speak and quick to listen. Instead of being offended by it, I also realized from talking to my law professors back at the law school, this was the best trial judge in the county. And so he held me to a very high standard. I mean, in a 9-month time period, I tried 15 jury trials to verdict, which meant I was always in trial prep. But as a result of that, I became a very good trial lawyer. And then this judge, who had some preconceived notions about how a Black lawyer should perform or behave, became one of my biggest allies. Even when I got married, if you were to come to my wedding at the time, it was like a model UN, because here is my family's African American, my wife's friends are Hispanic and also Indian. And then I've got all of these Caucasians from Jacksonville at the wedding. It was because I went in and did a good job to demonstrate that I had the same level of skill as anybody else, but I was initially being judged based on my skin color just because I walked into a courtroom and there were preconceived notions about how I was supposed to perform. And it taught me a valuable lesson. Although I could have complained about the judge and said, he's racist, by just doing my job better than anyone else, whether they're white or Black, I think it changed him and made him cause to think about his attitudes about African American lawyers, made it easier for others to come behind me in that particular division. And I remember when it was time to be promoted to the homicide unit, the same judge that told me not to be trifling, to never be late, and to never ask for a continuance was the one who picked up the phone and called the DA and goes, "He's prepared to be your best trial lawyer on the homicide team." So my hard work and not making a fuss about his attitudes ended up convincing him that maybe his preconceived notions were not appropriate, and then he became a very good ally.
Thank you. That's great. Great story. So next question. So we've had these incidents with the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many other Black men and women. How has that affected you? So Kirk, has it affected you, and has it affected your workplace? And has it affected you personally?
It's been a challenging time. I will say, probably like everyone on this call, it's been frustrating. I swung back and forth between being upset, disappointed, questioning whether the United States of America is at all what it's trumped up to be, so to speak. And then rethinking it and saying, okay, what can I do constructively? And thinking about what I can do and having those conversations internally. And within my company, we've done the same thing. I mean, we're pretty well known for really trying to have a leading voice with respect to equity and diversity in not only how we deliver our healthcare, but how we treat our members. Everyone should have the ability to get healthcare, and it should not be rationed, and nothing should be done to limit the access to healthcare just because of the color of your skin. And so we've had some really tough, heart-to-heart conversations with everyone. My Black colleagues, we share our experiences of racism, both implicit bias, explicit bias, microaggressions. We've talked about all of that and shared it with our non-Black colleagues and non-brown colleagues who really had their eyes open. But many of them, and Rich is exactly right, not everyone's racist who happens to be white. There are those who are doing the best they can, but they haven't had the same experiences. So what this has allowed us to do is to have some real, honest, heart-to-heart conversations. Some of them have been difficult. All of them have been eye-opening, and we've gotten closer. And what we're doing internally is redoubling our efforts to do very concrete things above and beyond what we've already done to really make a difference and to carry this forward, not only in healthcare, but how we interact in our communities and with our patients and our members. And for me personally, I'm looking for ways to really get out there and make a concrete difference. It's one thing to send a tweet, an email, or to say thumbs up, thumbs down. That's okay. But what's required now is action, real concrete action. And so I'm committing to do a number of things, including supporting various voting rights efforts and looking at other ways that I can truly make a difference and make concrete steps. So it's really caused me to dig down deep, reflect on my own experiences and those of my family, work with my company to help drive our efforts even further, but also identify concrete ways to make a true difference and keep the momentum going. I think we're at a very important inflection point in our history, and I really hope we take advantage of it and use it in a very constructive way, building on what our mothers and fathers and ancestors have done for years, for hundreds of years. We have to continue that rolling.
Thank you. Tiana,
So,
how's it, especially for you in the DA's office, right?
sure.
Someone who's worked on police misconduct cases. How has this affected you in your office?
Sure. So, first there's personally, every single time this becomes part of the national conversation, it impacts me very significantly. I generally have more time to sit in my feelings, have the conversations I need to have, be righteously angry, be upset, and get to work, right? This time has been such a frequency that you spoke about at the beginning, compounded on compounded and compounded, right? And then on top of a pandemic. So personally, it has been very difficult for me because I have had less time to rebound, but also the backdrop of this pandemic has been incredibly frustrating for me because the background of the pandemic and the timing of this time around when this became part of the national conversation really puts us all in a place to be able to quickly compare and contrast how our communities respond to crisis, depending on what the crisis is, what it looks like, and how we use our voice. And so reconciling, realizing, thinking upon the differences of how our communities respond to restricted movement and concepts of freedom in one subject, and then restricted movement and concepts of freedom when we're talking about the disparate impact on the Black community from law enforcement, that hurts. Professionally, there's this other layer. And I always speak about the difficulty and the challenge in being a Black prosecutor, because there is a duality there. And it comes from signing up to do the work of justice, many of us reluctantly being called to this particular field. I mean, I know that I was reluctantly called here, right? And part of that was because I didn't see anybody that looked like me doing this job. And I saw everybody that looked like me being disparately impacted by this role. So I had to have my own experiences to think about that. But on a professional level, you are feeling a secondary trauma, knowing, right, that the worst, like the tongue that will cut, the tongue that wants to hurt you, will remind you that you are an agent in a system that has a racist impact on people that look just like you. And that is a fact. So having to reconcile that, realizing that, you know, the purpose in which I came to this profession was because I knew diversity was important. I know that it is so necessary to have diversity of perspective, especially when we're evaluating cases, when we're charging them, when we're arguing cases, right? But having to, as has already been mentioned, live in these two worlds, which is not unique to just prosecutors, right? But having to live in these two worlds are especially difficult, and having to have those conversations and having the conversations and having to enter those conversations with grace and enter those conversations with patience when people come to the table with the same. Because even though you want to and you want to do the work, it absolutely takes a toll on you, because in the process of having these discussions, you can be re-traumatized. So it has been difficult. It has been a challenge. You know, I think in our office, as well as other DA's offices across the state of Texas, everyone is thinking about, how do we approach this? How do we handle this, right? And it starts with conversations. And for me, I have to realize that I'm sprinting, because I've been using this muscle. I joke all the time when things happen, and I say, listen, I've only been a prosecutor for 12 years, but I've been a Black woman for 37. So, you know, so I've been using this muscle, and me having to recognize that part of resolution, part of transformation, is that I have to adjust my pace as well. I want to push people. I want them to run faster, but I also have to be willing to stop sprinting for a while if people are willing to run with me. And so that's been kind of what I have been working with.
That's great answer. Thank you. Mr. Craig?
It's been extremely frustrating and painful. You know, one would have hoped after 50 years of the passage of the Civil Rights Act that we would be a lot farther along in the race issues in this country, and then period we made any progress. And when you're the father of a 16-year-old who says, look, Dad, I don't understand this. We go to an African-American church. I go to a multiracial school. Your friends are white, Black, and Jewish. How can this still happen in America today? Or having to sit down and explain to her, if you get stopped by the police when you're driving, roll the windows down, put your hands on the steering wheel. It's yes, sir. It's no, sir. Don't do anything to antagonize someone. She's like, why are we always treated differently? And so when she saw the death of George Floyd, you know, she was outraged and tried to explain to her, how do you channel that anger in a productive manner to make change, as opposed to in a destructive manner to make change? And so, you know, she begged me, Dad, I want to go march. I want to go march. Being that, you know, someone that has great concerns about overreaction at riots that could take place, and concerned about her safety. And my wife's an ICU doctor who has really made sure I understood the problems with COVID-19. You know, it's like, how do you put your daughter in a situation to experience history, have a voice, but not in a position where she could be harmed if something were to go wrong in the crowds? And I'm sure most people have seen what happened when they decided to push people back for a photo op here in DC. So we have daily conversations in our household about, how do you interact with people on a daily basis right now? How do you talk to your friends that are Caucasian about the issues and concerns that you have? And how to develop understanding, because I believe until someone can walk in your shoes, they can never truly experience what you've experienced. And understanding that, you know, your white counterparts are your friends, but they've had a completely different life experience than you. So it's gonna take them a lot longer to understand why you feel the way that you feel. Or trying to get used to the fact that when we walk into a store, people will follow us around if we're not dressed certain ways, assuming that we are going to do something improper, whereas your colleagues walk into the store, nothing's gonna happen to them, so don't put yourself in that position. So we had to have a lot of those conversations about how to deal with what's going on right now. In my professional life, it was quite interesting. I mean, I'm at a very good firm. When I initially got hired 4 years ago by Quinn Emanuel, I asked the chairman a very pointed question. I said, how are you doing on diversity? To see his reaction, his first words were, terrible, that's why I'm interviewing you right now. And people are like, what are you offended about? I said, no, he was being honest about the problem and saw a need to deal with that problem, which made me feel a lot more comfortable saying, this is someone that I can talk to about these issues. So when the George Floyd incident occurred, while I'm not on the firm's diversity committee, I get an email from the committee and from the service committee saying, we want to get your input here. And the firm decided it was time for a self-introspection about where were we on certain issues as a firm. How do we make things better for all diverse people in our ranks, staff and lawyers? And how do we increase our pipeline with law schools to ensure that we get enough African-American and people of color applicants, so that when we were making hiring decisions, the pool is large enough to organically increase what we bring into the firm. But then the chairman said, you know, more than that, instead of just putting a bunch of words on paper, we need to also support a lot of the organizations that believe in equality, justice, civil rights. And so the firm decided to put up, he said, look, I'm not going to just donate to one organization. The firm will match up to $100,000 any donation that the partners and staff gives out to these organizations that believe in inclusion, diversity, and civil rights. And so I'm sure, $100,000 is a good start. Well, I called the firm and they said, how do we do? Well, in 10 days' time, the staff and partners gave $290,000.
Wow, that's great.
To 45 different organizations. And then the firm matched that with $100,000. So it made me feel good to say we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. But now we're saying we need to reach out to law schools and develop programs that allow us to make sure that they are putting qualified, diverse applicants in our hiring packages so that we can consider them for employment. And then he put on the diversity committee that it's time for you to figure out what do we need to do internally to make our firm a more inclusive environment for everyone. So that we can not only just go out and hire people, but it doesn't do us any good to hire them if we can't retain them. And so he wants to try to figure out what do we need to be doing internally to change ourselves to make it a place where people feel comfortable to be there.
Great, that's really great. And Kirk, I think you mentioned a little bit about what Kaiser Permanente was doing.
Yes. One of the things we do, similar to what Richard just mentioned, all attorneys, leadership, our counsel, our frontline attorneys have actual concrete metrics that have to be met each year, and it's part of our structure, our bonus structure, so that we track how many minority and women-owned firms are actually doing our work. We are also reaching out to local high schools to identify young men and women who may have an interest in going to law school and bringing them in through internships or externships. Each of us, I'm pretty active. I'm on a number of boards, and I look for opportunities to also identify young men and women early in their career. Like when I was in high school, had great teachers, but also great role models to help me understand that there is something beyond high school, that you work hard and think beyond where you are now. So we recognize that pipeline programs are critically important. And so we're really supporting them not only through money, but with time, volunteering with them. And then going back to the law firms, not only do we internally track for each of our attorneys how many minority and women-owned firms we've hired to do our work, we tell the firms, especially those that are on our panel, we expect that we see diverse individuals actually engaged doing quality work, not just coming to the pitch, but actually doing the work, because we want to have attorneys stay with your firms so that then they can become partner and we can continue to send our work to you. That's what's critically important in retaining Black and brown young men and women in law firms, is having a mentor and having the ability to do real work and learn the ins and outs of practicing law. And that's one way we've identified to do that. And we're not the only ones, but we really are trying to push the needle to really ensure that that happens, because especially in our field, it's very complex. It's a very specialized area. You can't even do the work until you've had at least 10 to 15 years of experience. So it's critically important that you start developing a pipeline if you expect to make a difference.
That's great. And Tiana, is anything Montgomery County doing anything in the DA's office?
So what we have started doing on our leadership team is sharing resources and reading those resources together, right? And so you'll hear me say constantly, the first and most important part of this is that we have to talk about it. And the leadership team has to do that as well. So on our level, we want to be speaking the same language, right? You cannot get to the place to where you start putting things in action until you've held space and had those conversations. And so that is happening. But I think, and I would venture to say that in most organizations, including Kirk's and including Richard's, it's a process. And it's a process that is uncomfortable. And it's a process that is inconvenient. And I would venture to say that most people, depending on where you started this conversation, have different ideas of what it needs to look like. And so for me, the worst thing to do is to not talk about it. Our office has acknowledged that it's going on, and now we're in the steps of, let's get our heads together, look at articles, read voices, and think about how this impacts us collectively. Because the collective is the important part. There's a lot that can be done individually, but when we talk about systemic impacts on communities, it's more important that collectively we set expectations and we have a message. So in my division, we have been having conversations since this happened, and they're smaller court teams as well as a division. And we are having a training tomorrow that I'm training on for our misdemeanor folks. But because of where we are, because of the culture in the misdemeanor division in my office, this is a continuation of a conversation, right? I am constantly talking to them about how you think critically about the cases that you see, and you think globally, and you think about the impact that it can have, and you think about what's influencing it, and you're thinking about the information where it's coming from. But here's the thing. It doesn't need to be dependent on an individual in a position of leadership for those conversations to happen. It's got to happen collectively. It's got to be the fabric of an organization. And I think that those are the steps that everyone is taking. How do we move this from just an individual thing to a collective thing? Because really that's the only chance we have if it's collective. It can't just be if Tiana happens to be in this position, these conversations happen, right? So.
Those are great points. Is that you want to make sure it's organic. You want to make sure it's part of the fabric of the institution. Very good point. So we talked about how your work environments have adapted or changed, but you know the title of this workshop, this webinar, is racism and what we can do about it. So what can we do about it? Is it unsolvable, or is it solvable? So we talked a little bit about being organic, being part of the fabric of the organization. How does that happen? If you're no longer there, Tiana, for instance. Let's turn to you first.
So, I think about this often because my mom always reminds me that it is immoral to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of a problem. The good we do, we must do. Like Mother Teresa, that's always what she says. And when we think about racism and what we can do about it, I was laughing about the title of our webinar because I thought, no worries, just sign on and we'll handle it for you. By the time we're gone, it'll be done. But I think that what's most important, and I'm saying it again because I do think that is the most significant thing, is you first have to create a space, and then you have to hold a space. But those are two different things. You can create the space, but it may not be the person that needs to hold the space, because holding space means that I am meeting you where you are. I am listening without expectations. I am not seeking to control or direct your feelings. I just want you to be here and be able to talk about those. So the first thing I think we do is we do exactly what we're doing now, right, at the Law Center, in hopes that this is replicated everywhere. But you create a space and then you hold a space for people to talk about it. And then the next thing I think that is so important is that we have to educate ourselves. And you have to educate yourself with history, right? And voices, people's voices. So you need to start thinking about voices that are different than your own. You want to start hearing where people are coming from. You want to listen to that. But then as far as history goes, you want to make sure that you are reading history books and you're thinking critically about the perspective from which you're reading that information. Relating to our world, I always think about history and the idea that most people do not understand the history of policing. Most people do not recognize that the history of policing in the South was a slave patrol, and the history of policing in the North was to enforce labor. So no matter what you think about where policing is now, it's important to know the history of policing, because it puts you in a different perspective to see the world as it's happening now. So if I know that the history of policing in the South was as a slave patrol, and I know that stories are passed down through generations, right? Then I am going to be less shocked that there is a distrust between an entire community and the police. And so when we know our history, it's freedom, right? Because we can understand that there's so much that impacts the world and the spaces that we're in and influences them. And we start thinking about it through that lens.
And the other point you're making is that the history was policing Black people.
Exactly.
Right. So the origins of policing were basically policing Black people. So as you're saying that it's like Aunt Jemina or Uncle Ben, you know, you have those origins, you clean it up and make it a little bit different, but it's sort of hard to detach it from its history sometimes.
And only that, let's say that, you know, it's nothing is impossible, but you have to be intentional to resist the influence of that history. So if we get a forecast that it's going to rain tomorrow, we understand that rain is possible tomorrow, then we are more likely to carry an umbrella and less likely to get wet. Understanding our collective history of America, no matter what industry you're in, right? Big law, prosecution, understanding that history, we can understand the forecast. We can identify that maybe we need an umbrella so that we don't get wet. But if we live in a world where we don't even think it's possible to rain, then how are we thinking about whether or not we need to pack our umbrella? So when we're talking about racism and what we do about it, the first thing that we have to do after we create that space is we have to educate ourselves with different voices, with different texts. We need to know our history. And then we need to reflect on the impact of that. And I think that ultimately, once we reflect on that, we have to decide whether or not we're going to acknowledge it. But we have to know our intentions and we have to know our limitations. If your intention is not to think about the world globally or consider how history has impacted our present, then you're not coming to the table in a spirit that will get us there to help us transform. And if you are not yet ready, i.e. knowing your limitations, then you're not in that space either. It's okay to not be ready to do that, right? You've got to know your limitations. But at the end of the day, it's most significant that we are being intentional about examining the spaces that we're in and searching for that.
And what I would say is, I agree with you 100% that so much of our young people don't know our history, right? Because it ends the Civil War and slavery, Jim Crow's over, we don't cover really past World War II, we don't cover the Civil Rights Movement. It's like all that was a long time ago. So what are people complaining about?
Yes, we checked a box, right? We checked the box during the Civil Rights Movement, we're good. We checked the box when Obama was elected, we're good, right? But understanding that the influence that it has on our spaces is something that we have to intentionally guard against, puts us in a better position to guard against it. Does it mean it's happening all the time? Absolutely not. But how are we prepared to guard against it if we don't acknowledge that there's a potential to be impacted by it, right? Like we are not admitting defeat, admitting that everybody's a bad person by acknowledging the influence that racism can have. But we collectively have to be prepared to do that. We have to be prepared to be inconvenienced. It is inconveniencing you to have to sit down and talk about something that's uncomfortable. We have to be ready to be uncomfortable. We have to know that not everybody, again, is running the same pace because some people have more time to use this muscle than others. But we still have to recognize that we all need to be working out. If we don't do that, then we're not even starting where we need to be.
Thank you. Richard Craig, what do we do about it? You're on mute.
In addition to talking about it, we need to understand that for law firms in particular, we're in the business of making money. And so we've spent all our time focused on when is the next deadline, when is the next case, what is the next challenge. So sometimes we neglect to think about bigger societal issues. But on the issue of racism, it's something that we need to eradicate at its core, which means, we all have to understand that we all have implicit biases. And so one of the things firms should think about doing is have implicit bias training for everyone. It's not a problem to have a bias. The problem becomes when you don't deal with that bias, and that bias then impacts your decision-making process. And then put metrics in place. For example, one of the key metrics that determine a associate is going to be successful or not is the work they get. So have a quantifiable system that can actually tell you what kind of work has been assigned to all of your associates, so that when you see someone not getting work, you can deal with the problem earlier on in someone's career versus letting them die on the vine, not getting the work ever, and then they don't have the hours you need to be successful in big law. It's about identifying ways to make sure when you're in business and you have to recruit talent, that your talent reflects not only the culture within your law firm, but understand that it's going to reflect your bottom line. Because if you look at the legal departments across this country, there are more people of color, Latinos, Asians, African Americans, females that are not coming in through the in-house rank, which means 5-10 years down the road, I need to have a workforce that looks like the clients that I want to recruit. And it's giving your people of color opportunities to build relationships, take them to pitches, teach them how to develop business. To be candid, if you want to have change, you have to have economic influence. No economic influence, you cannot insert change in any organization. So when corporate clients issue things like call to action, while I like those statements, it only makes a difference in big law when it's followed by some of the things Kirk talked about, is that making sure that when there is a pitch and people of color come to the pitch, African American come to the pitch, that they get a chance to actually work on your matters, that they have a chance to compete to become the relationship partner, so they have an economic voice. And for African American partners, in order to have influence, you have to have the ability to give work out to all associates. If you have no work to give out, that diminishes your value to any organization. So therefore, it limits the impact you can have to make change in your organization. And so one of the things I think firms need to do is think about, it's hard enough to recruit diverse talent. Let's develop mechanisms that address any weaknesses that may be in their performance that allows them to flourish and develop into the lawyers we need them to be, because it's cheaper to keep them than to keep hiring new talent that walks out your door early or doesn't make it through the system. And so, from a business perspective, it begins with a tone at the top. If the managing partners, if the managing committees make diversity a priority for them, it will then trickle down to the practice group leaders saying, if diversity is important to the management and it's a metric that I'm going to get measured on that's going to impact my pay, it makes it something real that say, I have not a financial interest to also make sure that not only it's the right thing to do, but it also impacts my bottom line. And when people understand it from that perspective, I think you get a lot more action and commitment to get it done, because there's a cultural change. If it's not important to the C-suite, it's not important to the managing partner, then it's really not important to the organization. But if it's important to the people running the organization, then it becomes important to the fabric and culture of the country, of the company.
Great. So you've talked about implicit bias training. And one of the questions we had from the audience is, how do we get a firm to do that? How, if your firm is not interested, if it's not coming from, the managing partner, if it's not coming from the top, if it's not coming from the corporations that you're working with, how does an associate figure out ways to ask the firm or get the firm to do the implicit bias training?
That's a very tough question from this perspective. Fortunately, at my firm, I have a management team that's sensitive to diversity issues and has basically directed the diversity committee to come up with different programs to address inclusion in our firm. If I'm that associate, I would want to try to talk to some of the younger partners, that's like the next generation, who are probably more open to the idea, and explain the importance of that for them. So as they move up in the organization, you soon will have someone who has an ear willing to hear what your concerns are. But at the same time, you have to perform. I've learned that people may have real bad attitudes and may have implicit bias, but if you're making the money and you're doing a great job, they're inclined to listen to what you have to say from time to time. So it makes a big difference. So when you're given an assignment, you knock it out of the park. I mean, like the judge that I had who said never be late, you just don't miss deadlines. I mean, it's a situation where I understand that I can't be as good as my colleagues. I must be better. I can't run as fast, so I must run harder. I understand that doesn't mean I'm gonna get what they get, but at least will put me in the game to compete and have a voice at the table.
Good. So Kirk, so we're talking about what can we do about racism?
You know, we could spend the rest of the afternoon and into tomorrow about that. But I think within the time we have, I think having conversations like this are critically important, not only to have them amongst ourselves, our families, but with our white allies, because we cannot do this on our own. We have to have allies. And the one thing that is very encouraging, in spite of all the pain that we've all experienced with the murder of Mr. Floyd, is to see the diversity of the crowds that are out protesting. So taking that, we also need to find ways to engage in whatever forum we're in, our white allies. Find out who they are. The way you do that, or the way I've done that, is just share my own story, be very approachable, but also get a cadre of folks who think the same way. And you all come together and say, you know, we need to have a conversation. I'm feeling this. He or she is feeling this. We suspect you're curious, or you should at least know. I think having those conversations then will help you build a foundation to be able to make some changes. First, it has to start locally and doing concrete things, either reaching out to your local NAACP, La Raza, whatever it is, to engage individuals in your local communities, and then work from there on, you know, horizontally and vertically. You have to do it locally and then go up. And that's what I and colleagues have been doing here. That's what we've been doing here at my company. You know, we're fortunate enough to have a leading voice. We are fortunate to have, you know, a strong platform to make strong statements. And within my own legal department, both nationally and within our regions, you know, diversity is really important to us. Diversity with the big D, and also not just within how we deliver healthcare, but how we interact in our communities. So those steps are what we can do to continue to move the needle on racism. And, you know, let's not fool ourselves. This is not something that's going to go away in 5, 10 years. It's going to be an incremental change. I mean, we've been dealing with this for 16, 19. We also have been dealing with it since Reconstruction. So it is a long journey, but I think continuing to have those conversations, supporting organizations that are out there doing the work, like the NAACP, you know, all the other organizations that are out there taking the lawsuits, doing the voting rights work, you know, writing to Congress, doing those things that make a difference, that pull on the coattails of those that should be doing a better job that aren't. And just continuing to be prescriptive and aware of what's working and what's not working, and making changes when we need to. You know, we have seen over time that we have to do more than just march. We have to march, hold people accountable, and take things in our own hands to make things change. And so that is something we will have to continue to do. But also, I think, do what we can within our organizations to speak up, to speak to those that are at higher levels of companies above us. I'm very fortunate in that, you know, our general counsel gets it and has gotten it for years and has made, you know, really big changes within our organization. We have, I think we're approaching 30% as far as diversity in the legal department. And we're not happy with that. And encouraging folks like me and others to go out and speak to organizations, speak to communities about the need to be open and think broadly about diversity and take concrete steps to make those changes. I think those incremental steps from all of us will continue to move things forward.
That's great. Here goes some audience questions. So one's directed to Tiana. If you're the DA in the Montgomery, hello? Oh,
I'm
so,
here.
yeah, so you're the DA in the Montgomery County office. What would you implement in policy to address police misconduct? Or what law bill would you push forward in the next session?
So I am an assistant DA in Montgomery County. I get my power from the elected in Montgomery County. Let's make that clear. Right. So I have the honor of assisting the elected DA in Montgomery County. So, you know, it's interesting because me and my boss have conversations related to that question all of the time. And we think big about them. So the first question was, what would I do to address police misconduct? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think is so important, we talked about knowing history, right? I think that it's important that, and if there's any law enforcement officers out there, they're going to hate me for this. I think that we need to add additional training, cue the grumbling. And it's not just officers. I mean, we've got a room full of attorneys. How many times do you grumble when you have to go to another CLE, right? We are, all of us are adverse to someone else sitting us in a room and telling us what to do. But I think having training that's focusing on the history of policing is important. I also think having a training on implicit bias is important. Now, there are cultural awareness classes for training that exist. There are racial profiling classes that exist. But when we talk about bias, that's a different topic, right? I think that the other thing that we do is Wait,
hold on, could you explain why that's a different topic?
Sure. Okay.
Explain how bias is a different topic.
Yes. And so, and I am not, nor do I claim to be an expert on all of the TCOL training, but I am aware of a cultural awareness class that is required by Texas peace officers. And there's also a racial profiling class that is required. And those speak specifically to, you cannot profile someone based on their race. My understanding from speaking to individuals that have gone through that class is that it does not speak about how the brain works. When we talk about bias and we talk about cognitive bias, and we talk about implicit bias and explicit bias, and we don't have tons of time, but we think about those as shortcuts that our brain takes to make decisions, and we really break down why that puts us in danger of making shortcuts that could negatively impact somebody unfairly, then we start getting into the meat, right? And so I think that it's important to dive deeper into bias when we're talking about policing. You know, that's something that as prosecutors, we have started doing intentionally on the state level. We have a statewide bias training that we have started implementing at all levels and made part of the curriculum for new prosecutors in the state of Texas. So just thinking about how the mind works is super important. And so I would like to see more of that. As far as legislation, listen, I am not a legislator, and there are tons of bills and legislative ideas out there on how to do that. I know that they focus on training, but at the end of the day too, what we have to do is we have to hold officers accountable when they do engage in misconduct. So in my time at our office, when the Public Integrity Division, which is what I was formerly the chief of that unit, that was created in, I want to say 2000, I started in 2008. And so that was created probably in 2009 thereafter, or 2009. So as part of the new administration under my boss, the Public Integrity Division was founded. And so you have to start holding police officers accountable for misconduct. Now, that includes having and putting your resources into specialized prosecution for that. So in our office, we have prosecutors that specialize in that, right? They specialize in knowing the challenges that are associated with holding officers accountable criminally. But there are two different worlds. And I always tell this to grand juries when I speak to them. I always tell this to the public when I speak to them. There is a lane of criminal conduct and there is a lane of administrative conduct. And only one of those things does the elected district attorney have control over, right? That is the law, the statutes, the penal code to hold an officer criminally responsible. But there is a whole wide range of things that are administrative that you would want, oh my gosh, this is so offensive, it needs to be criminal, but it's not, based on the way that our statutes are written. And all of that happens at the department level. So as far as criminal conduct, I believe that implicit bias across all of our sectors is important, because we, as citizens in the state of Texas, as judges, as lawyers, as jurors, we are called upon to interpret facts and apply those facts to law. And our statutes are written in such a way that we can rely on what we evaluate a situation to be. So we're not going to define this word for you, but what does it mean to an ordinary and prudent person? Well, what is an ordinary and prudent person? That changes based on your perspective, based on your exposure, based on your experience. So I think that there's a lot of ways we can attack it, but one of the first things that I would do is I would ensure that there is more accessible, more targeted training in regards to bias in law enforcement in general, and that we recognize and own the fact that an interpretation of the criminal statute depends a lot on our perspective and our exposure and our experience. So we have to be personally committed to thinking about and approaching situations outside of self and having a more global perspective. I could go on and on about this question all day.
That's great. That's great.
I don't want this to be a talk about.
No, but it's great. It's excellent. I think the audience is going to get a lot out of the conversation. And it was directed to you because of the obvious issues with what we've seen in society with the police killings. Here's another question.
As encouraging as it could be, right? These conversations are happening all the time. Mm-hmm. Lunchtime conversation for us. Okay, what do we do to make public safety better? What do we do to be more consistent in enforcement of X, Y, Z? So we are constantly having these conversations.
Good. Here's another question. Do you think that it's important to let others know that you realize it's a tremendous cultural divide between obviously educated Blacks and not so educated Blacks regarding formally educated, understanding the daily anguish of constant disrespect, knowing you educationally inferior and no opportunity? So should I trust you, the educated Blacks? So it's saying that there's a distinction, or is there a distinction? So let me rephrase the question. Do you think there's a distinction between among African Americans between those who are highly educated and those who are maybe not as well educated? And is there distrust between the two groups? Is the question I have. What do you think? So I think Richard Craig looks like.
Not that I want to answer, but I'll take a stab at it. You have to understand that in a lot of ways, the people on this Zoom conference live in very different worlds than the average African American that may be in society. And by that I mean, if you look at my neighborhood that I live in right now, it's probably majority Anglo-Saxon Protestant than African American. But I choose to live here because it's a safer environment for my family when I'm out of town. I don't have to worry about what's going to happen to my wife and daughter if I'm not here at the household. So I make certain conscious decisions to put my family in a position to make sure they're safe. But the result of that is that means not all my neighbors are going to look like me, talk like me, or sound like me, but I think it's to give a better understanding of what society is about. I do find that being a former prosecutor, former DA, that when I talk to members of my church who may not have had the opportunity to get a college education, we kind of see the world maybe through two different lenses, because my lens has been broadened by the exposure that I've gotten through college, law school, and doing work around the globe. Their world has been just their little community. They've never left Southeast DC, or they never left Prince George County. So their view of the world is sometimes different from mine. But what I don't try to do is say I must speak for them. I mean, while we have a lot of issues in common, and by that I mean, if a police officer pulls me over or pulls someone who's not educated, the first thing they see is not where I went to school, but it's the color of my skin. So I get treated exactly the same way they get treated in that situation. The difference is I would think about how to respond differently to de-escalate the situation, whereas they may respond out of frustration that would escalate the problem, which then leads to things we've seen, including George Floyd. So I do think that there is a duality that we deal with in our professional lives, in our home life a lot of times, in that, you know, we all come from different walks of life. We all have different friends. And I just know that by being more educated, I've had more opportunities to have more broad experiences to understand a lot of diverse people groups versus my colleagues who may not have had the same exposure, which means they work in I mean, they're gainfully employed, but the type of employment they have limits their exposure to others.
Any other thoughts from Kirk or Tiana?
I'll jump in. Thanks for the opportunity, and I agree with Richard Craig. You know, I am a strong believer in the Bible saying, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think however we treat the least educated of us impacts us all, because you're very right. When we are in our cars, when we're out, it doesn't matter where I went to school. It doesn't matter that I'm a graduate of the law center. It doesn't matter that I have whatever degrees I have, that doesn't matter. All they see me as another Black man. And so even though there may be differences between how we look at the world, when you compare someone who's gone to college or has education or has traveled versus someone who never left their hometown, when it comes down to it, it shouldn't really matter as far as how they're treated. They should be treated equally in the eyes of the law. They should be treated equally by our police, and they should have equal expectation of access to voting rights and all the other things without being shut down or limited just because of the color of their skin or because they did not go to school. And I always think about, not everyone in my family went to college. I was the first. Yet I love my family dearly. And I have friends that I've had for many, many years who didn't go to college. And I would not want them to be treated any less than I'm treated. So, the question is a good one. In a way, it's one that we all confront and we have to be honest about. In some ways, going back to thinking about the question itself, I could have said the question has within it an assumption of somewhat implicit bias. I mean, we all have implicit bias. Acknowledging that, yes, but what's important is we acknowledge it and deal with it. So what's important is that we ensure that no matter who that individual is, regardless of whether they went to college, live in our neighborhoods, have our experiences, what really matters is that they are treated equally and not denigrated and are not limited in any way because of their race or because of their lack of education.
Thank you. Tiana, any thoughts? You're on mute. Let's see.
Here we go. Am I understanding correctly that the question is, how do you navigate Black people with education versus not, or how do you address that? Or
It seems to have implied that there's distrust between the two communities.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Or is there distrust between the two communities?
Yes. And so I would say that there's not a distrust between the two communities, right? I think that this is another example of how all of us need to examine every nook and cranny of every single space that we are associated with and ask ourselves how that space reinforces bias or how it was influenced by bias. Because when we talk about education becoming a way to categorize Black people, that is problematic. Because when we are referring to education, we're talking about degrees. And that is a system that is seeped and has been influenced by racism. And I think that all of these environments, what I always go back to is that, and struggle with, none of these environments, not law, not big law, education, none of these environments were created or formed with us in mind. And when I say us, I mean people of color, I mean more specifically Black people. And if these environments were contemplated with us in mind, they were contemplated in Black people being less valuable. And so we have to scrub every nook and cranny, because it's going to change the way that we have these conversations and that we talk about them. So even the idea of separation on a level of education is influenced by and seeped in a racial bias that, when combined with power, impacts the way we think and the way we treat each other and the way we act. And that's why we have to be so fierce about guarding against it, or we don't have a chance.
And you also see residential, I mean, Richard Craig may live in a mostly white neighborhood, but other people live in different neighborhoods. And what you find is that even if you have poor whites, they're more likely to live in a middle-class neighborhood. Not all the time, but more likely, and benefit from the educational system and everything else. And nobody knows that they're necessarily poor or lower income. And that's sort of sometimes the difference. Another couple of questions.
Yes, if I may jump in before you go to the next question, but living in a majority neighborhood has its disadvantages as well. And by that I mean, when I'm driving home, if it's late at night, I'm liable to get stopped by the neighborhood police and say, "What are you doing here?" My wife's coming from the ICU. It happens routinely. And like I said, we've been here now 10 years. Not most of the police, but let them hire somebody new, and we're driving home to our home, and we're going to get pulled over, and we're going to get asked for ID of what are you doing in this neighborhood. And so there's been a number of times I've had to call and say, "Get your sergeant over here," because there's no other reason to stop us but that we're African American in a majority neighborhood at nighttime, which is highly offensive.
Yep, understood. Next question is asking about the protests. And it says, the question is, how does the panel feel about the presence of outside influences? And this is this is the questioner's question. So how does the panel feel about the presence of outside influences whose sole purpose is to hijack and misdirect the messages behind the peaceful protests?
I'll go first with that one, living in Portland, Oregon. I don't know, you probably have seen some of the protests that have been happening over the past, I think we're now 14 days, 15 nights consistently here in Portland. Generally they are very peaceful, but many nights after about midnight, there's another element that comes out, where most of the protesters have already left their peaceful protests. There's a subgroup that comes in and decides to spray graffiti in buildings, loot, break glass downtown. Portland is a city of bridges. We have 14 bridges that span the Wilmette and the Columbia rivers. And, downtown is built along the banks, and, it's a beautiful city. And people, that element will come in and do all the damage, and that's what's reported on. And so it's very upsetting because the city is trying to allow space for peaceful protests, but on the same time, we have to have a strong police force to go in and protect the businesses that are there and have been here well before this started. And so it really confounds the message. And depending on who the messenger is, they will take that and say, look, all they want to do is loot and tear up businesses, and the true message of peaceful protest for change gets lost. So it really frustrates me But I think I would still encourage those who want to protest to continue to do so peacefully. And, law enforcement and our state and local leaders are doing the best they can to, at least here in this area, to be very specific about recognizing that the peaceful protesters have a message that we agree with. You should do that. But there's this other element, and no one can really point to whether or not they're associated with any specific group, but they are there, and they come in and they tear things up. So it's a very difficult issue to deal with, but I don't think we should allow it to get in the way of the larger message. And that's something that we're going to have to work through, and it's going to take continued work with our local police and our local legislators to recognize the difference.
My concern is that the element Kurt is talking about will give those who want to diminish the legitimate protest for change a vehicle to try to minimize the legitimate concerns. No one's condoning rioting, no one's condoning crime being committed, and the police should step in when people are doing things and make arrests, irrespective of someone's skin color. But that doesn't mean you should say, well, therefore, with a broad brush, the entire protest is of that vein. You still should stay focused on there's a real concern that's led people to the streets, exercise their First Amendment right, about how policing is done in this country, that is disparate treatment toward African Americans, and that should never change. But my fear is that those who are looking for a convenient excuse to ignore the real problem or to try to paint with a broad brush in racist terms will use the protest, and it will hit the news, and that's all that's focused on, and you lose the value in the protest that's taking place when that happens.
Tiana, you have any thoughts?
Agreed to both.
Okay.
Yes, it's bad. It's a crime. What we do with crimes is what we will have always done with crimes. But let's talk about what brought us to the point of people wanting to march together.
Exactly.
So there's a couple of questions about what does allyship with Black people look like? What would that look like for you? How would that work?
So that's
a good question.
Really, yes, that's a really good question. Not that you ever asked that, needed my approval, but thank you for asking that question. And here's first and foremost, it's going to look different depending on what your relationship with the ally is. There is not one size fits all. But, and this wasn't the question, but maybe it'll answer some of that. What I admire, what I appreciate, what I love, what inspires me from allyship is, one, holding that space in such a way that does not say, okay, I want to talk about this, but I want to talk about it on my terms, not yours, right? So that's the first thing, holding space. And holding space does not mean we have a goal, we have an agenda. Holding space means let's talk about where we're at. Secondly, from the allies that I have in my life, you are committed. You have sweat equity. You have ownership. You're not just checking in to check a box to say, oh, I heard that this was an issue. You have ownership. You are prioritizing it. You are making it part of your fabric. You are having that allyship reflected in the way that you live your life, in the way that you see things, in the choices that you make, in the money that you spend. There's a true ownership in it. So that is what true allyship looks like. True allyship looks like, I am going to come to the table with vulnerability. I'm going to leave ego at the door. I'm going to resist every single urge to fall into my default perspective, which happens to be the default of the majority of America, because I was contemplated, my existence was contemplated when the country and all of our systems were created. I'm going to resist every urge to make this about me. And I'm going to focus in on the injured party. And lastly, what I admire and am inspired by the allies in my life is that this is not a one-stop shop, and this is not a one-stop issue. Because this national conversation that we are having now is absolutely about the disparate impact on law enforcement against people of color, more specifically Black Americans. But we have missed an opportunity, and we have not done what we need to do as human beings if we cannot readily apply this same allyship, this same vulnerability, this same leaving ego at the door, this same coming to a place where I am not coming from self, and I'm coming from you, and I'm coming from injured party, then we've missed the boat. Because please believe that this language, this action that we're taking, this allyship, has many other places to be applied. Many other places. Sexuality, right? Ethnicity, religion, it has many other places. And so true allyship recognizes that I'm coming to you in this space to be this ally, but we're also going to apply this inconvenience, this discomfort, this language, this support. We're going to apply that broadly because we understand that it's part of a larger impact.
Right.
For me, it's being willing to be vulnerable yourself and putting yourself at risk for others. I'll give you a good example of that. Whenever you're in a partnership and you're ready to do something publicly, you should let the chairman know and the managing partner of your office know that you're about to do a program like this. So I sent an email to the managing partner, to the chairman, saying, here's the link, here's what I'm doing tomorrow night. If you have any questions, let's talk about it. And the question that came back was, do you mind if we share this with the entire partnership? And I've said, I don't mind at all. And then the managing partner sent an email out to the entire partnership in the firm saying, everyone at the firm should sign up for this. If you knew Rich the way I know Richard, you want to hear what has to be said tonight. And so you all should link on to that. And then after his email went out, partners are emailing back saying, we're going to log on to the program. Now, I didn't ask him to do that, but to show his commitment, he volunteered to publicize to all the partners and then use his influence to encourage others that this is something you need to listen to. To me, that's being a true ally, saying he put himself out on a limb for a cause that I believe in to encourage others to take advantage of this program.
Yes, so beautifully said. And I mean, that I just have to share my story too. I made the call to my boss, the elect, and I said, hey, I've been asked to be on this panel. He's like, oh, where is it? Not, what are you gonna say? What is it about? I wanna be there. Oh, well, it's virtual, right? So, I'm sure that Kirk has a similar story.
Yes, yes.
But that type of support is what allows us to be in this space, having these conversations when the same with my office. First assistant sent out an email. Hey guys, this conversation is happening. Attend if you can.
Yep.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I 100% agree first with your excellent articulation, Tiana, about allyship. And I've had the same experience here, at my company. It does require vulnerability. It requires you to come with a mindset, I'm going to not just hear, I'm going to listen. Listen to where the other person's coming from, because we have to acknowledge we have different experiences. We're not going to view it the same way, but come with an honest desire to truly listen, hear where the other person is, meet them where they are, explain. They may not understand our experience. Be willing to explain it to really help them understand, and also conversely, help your ally understand, help be open to understanding your ally's point of view as a non-Black person, because it is so critical that we have these vulnerable, open and honest conversations, because if we don't, we will not move forward. We truly need these allies. And, I'm really fortunate to have many, I feel, in my company, including my boss, and I had a very positive experience when I told him about this. Said, I am glad you are going to do this. And I shared it, with many others. So, our former CEO, who unfortunately passed away, was a leading thought was a thought leader in the world, not only on healthcare, but on many issues of race, Mr. Bernard Tyson. And we still continue to take that role, even under our new CEO, and it's ingrained in, the company and in our DNA. I mean, we're not perfect. We have work to do, and we acknowledge that, but we're doing what we can to continue the conversation, especially now. It's very critical, and we can only do it with allies across the globe, within the nation, and in our own communities and with our companies. I mean, it's multi-layered, but I agree, allyship is critically important for us to really turn the tables on racism in this country and across the world.
Your partners say they're here, Richard.
Thank you. I appreciate it. But it makes a difference when you have a partnership being willing to have the conversation, put their money where their mouth is, and it means that there is hope that if my firm can do it, the partners can do it, others can do it. And that's why I thoroughly enjoy where I'm at,
We
So
have to normalize, oh, I'm sorry, Dean.
No, go ahead, finish.
Normalize the fact that it's not easy. I think that we have really done a disservice collectively. Collective America has done a disservice by conditioning people not to have these hard conversations. And so we have to normalize the fact that it will be inconvenient, that it will be uncomfortable, but that it is the only thing that matters, that it has to happen, right? And so, there is no such thing as a perfect allyship. And I just kind of want to add that too. You cannot go into an allyship saying this is going to be perfect, because then you're wanting it on your terms, right? It's not perfect. It says, I'm acknowledging what's happening, and I'm committed, and I don't know when, I don't know how, but I'm in this journey with you, and I may mess up, and I need you to call me in, right? It's not perfect. These things can't be perfect, because in fact, we were conditioned to do exactly what we're doing now, be uncomfortable about it. Am I going to say the right thing? Not us, but the collective we, right? We are having to unlearn years of how to have these conversations.
Or not have the conversation.
Or not have the conversation, exactly.
Because we don't have the conversations, right?
Exactly.
We don't have the conversations. Because the conversations are too hard.
They're
As you
too
say,
hard.
We're afraid we'll say the wrong thing. Or sometimes we don't know what to say, right? We don't know what to say. And very often what I find is that people of color in this space, these white, multiracial spaces, are able to have the conversations because they have had to have these conversations all their lives, or some portion of their lives. And this is we start with the first question, is like, when did you know you had a race, right? When did you know have a race? Because we've had to, it's what, the soul double consciousness, right? We've had to be able to navigate sort of the white world, but also navigate the Black world. And for many people who are white, all they navigate is their own world. And so it's hard for them, at their ages, maybe, because they've never had that experience, to actually do that. And that's why it's hard. That's why it's uncomfortable, because they've never had to have those conversations. But if they want, what struck me about what Tiana said is that if you want, it's a relationship. If you want a relationship with us and want us to feel fulfilled, etc., to be valued, it's like any other relationship, that you want the person to be there with you, to follow you, to work with you, to understand you, whatever their needs are. That's what you want. That's what allyship is. It's some sort of relationship, friendship, whatever you want to call it. That's what you want in an ally. So there was another question about African-American percentage at UH, the percentage of African-American law school students. And Sandra answered, I guess, on the chat line that it's about 6%. And then there was a question like, what can we do to increase the numbers? And this was for alums. The question was like, what can alumni do to increase the numbers?
I'll take a first stab at that. I think the pipeline program that is in current existence at UH Law is a great element of moving the needle as I mentioned earlier, that's something we do here within my company, because when you think about it, in order to really get to law school, you have to start preparing yourself to think and write well early on. There are people who don't and just make the switch and they can do it. But in order to make a difference, to prepare our young men and women of color to be able to even consider going to law school, they have to have those experiences. So I think pipeline programs, mentorship, it is so incredibly valuable and important, especially for people of color, to have strong mentors, individuals, men and women who they see are doing what they want to do or what they aspire to do, and just talk to them, hear their struggles, but give them encouragement to show them, I've gone through that same thing. I've experienced that same questioning of whether I can do this, but you can do this. And, those are things that we can do as an alumni, to talk to um, individuals in our communities that may be interested, to recent graduates, making a connection with them if we can, as much as we can, to encourage them. But to me, the pipeline program is so critically important because that's where you catch people so that they start doing the hard work in college to do well. That way they will be in the best position to do well on the LSATs and then get into law school, and just encourage them along the way, act as mentors, but help lay the foundation and give them somewhat of a roadmap, because all of us had different experiences. The difference is, and the commonality is, I would say the difference is the road that we took to get here, but the commonality is we made it and we did it and we've been successful. So we know how to get there. So let's share that with others so that they can do the same.
So the pipeline program is 6 years old, and the students are college students, and they increase their LSAT scores by 12 to 14 points, which is significant. 14 points is amazing and makes a big difference between going to law school, not going to law school, going to some law schools versus other law schools. The challenge for us in attracting them, so many of them go to schools all across the country, but for us, we have about, I think, 8 who participated at UH and done amazingly well. But scholarships is sort of the challenge, right, for those students. That's it for us to attract more African American students is scholarship dollars, which are really crucial. But I don't know if anybody else has some other
Dean, if I
thoughts.
may, that's what I was going to say. As alumni, one of the things we did at my other law school, UF, is 2 things. We've increased our giving significantly and had it earmarked for certain programs at the school for recruitment purposes. But then when the school identifies candidates they really want, they call upon the alumni to also help recruit the student. No, it's because when you get a great qualified applicant, they get a lot of offers. And so what's going to make the difference between your school and other schools? So we found that by having alumni pick up the phone, talk about their experiences at the law school and why it's a great place to go, it's aided the school in its efforts to recruit the top talent. And then make sure there's funding available for them when they get there. Are the 2 things that I would highly recommend.
Okay.
I agree.
Tiana, any thoughts? Good.
I agree. I had many a law school to choose from, but I got an email from Dean Tennessee that said, hey, you want to come spend a weekend with us? There's a Boston banquet going on. I got current students I want to introduce you to. And it made all the difference. So again, representation matters. And I think we can even take this more broadly when we're talking about retention of Black attorneys or Black prosecutors or Black attorneys in big law. Representation matters, connection matters, community matters, getting it off of the piece of paper. And even if we in our spot can't provide what that potential student or that potential prosecutor or that potential big law associate needs, we say, don't you worry, I'm gonna find that resource for you, right? You mentioned that I was the first Black district court chief in Montgomery County. When I went into the office, there were no Black prosecutors. But I had a mentor who worked in the Harris County District Attorney's office, and she kept tabs on me and would not let me go. I'm not a prosecutor in Harris County, but Veronica said, I don't care where you're gonna go as a prosecutor, I've got you. So even if we are unable to be in that same circle, making a commitment to connect people that we want to retain, that we care about, with that resource, even if it means trying to connect with an ally or getting into someone else's purse and saying, can I spend some of your money because I don't necessarily have it? But I think all of those things are important.
Good, that's great. A question for Tiana about where do you stand on defunding the police was another question.
Oh, goodness. So, Dean, I thought that we were gonna.
Just repeating what the questions from the audience are saying.
Yeah, so here's the thing. That takes more attention, more grace, more time than we have. And that's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to state a question. This is me saying, in service of the conversation that we're having about racism, in service of the real change that all of us are working on, that conversation is going to take time. I will tell you, the first thing that I'll say in regards to defunding the police is that you first have to agree on the language that you are using. It is unfair for me to answer that question without first defining what defund the police means.
Mm-hmm, yeah, exactly.
You know what I'm saying? So I will tell you, am I in support of taking a hard look at where our money goes in law enforcement and spending it, allocating it such that it reflects our priority of prevention as well as public safety, and takes into consideration other aspects of society that we know impact crime? Absolutely. I will tell you that many of us in the law enforcement community have experienced doing that. Do we want to take this money and put this money into a prosecutor that's going to focus on drug court or focus on veterans court? Do we want to take this money or ask for more money so that I can have a couple of deputies who are specialized in mental health, right? So these are things that are already happening. But so do I agree with taking a tough look at our resources and our money and how it's being spent and prioritizing prevention and thinking globally about how society impacts and predicts crimes that are committed? Absolutely. But going into detail about what that looks like and how that happens, send me an email and we can chat about it.
Any other thoughts? Oh, well, Richard, you were a former prosecutor.
No, I'm just going to say, while I agree that you should always analyze the best way to spend resources to get the most bang for your buck, to benefit the community, reduce crime in the community, and maybe put in programs that keep people from falling into the track of crime, 100% supporting that. But if you're saying defund the police that we don't have law enforcement presence in our communities, that's something I cannot agree with, because that presence is needed to ensure the safety of all in the community, not just whites, but blacks, everyone. So I agree that you should make sure the money's been spent in a way that maximize the benefit to reduce the disparate treatment that may happen in the system. But I would never agree that you should take money away from the police, that we have a lawless society and there's no mechanism to protect society going forward. I just think that's a non-starter. It's another example of giving someone an argument that can be used to undermine the legitimate concerns that have been articulated by the protests. Because you're not going to have anyone who's going to say, yes, let's defund the police. That's crazy. But I can get people to say, we need to change how they do policing, better their training, get them so that they treat everyone equally, then that makes sense to me. So I just think we shouldn't give our opponents information that can be spun in a way that delegitimizes the valid concerns we have about the disparate treatment in our system.
But the most important thing that we need to do is we have to commit ourselves to doing the research, because so many people spend time deflecting and arguing over semantics, and that is a distraction, and that is a waste of time, in my opinion. I want you to sit down and I want you to talk to people who say, I want to abolish the police. I want you to hear them, right? I want you to sit down and I want you to talk to people that say, I want to defund, and I want you to hear them. Again, we're holding a space. We're taking ourselves out of said space. We're being vulnerable. We're leaving ego. And so we are coming to the table to have that conversation. But I think I don't just want to leave it at law enforcement, because we have to think globally about how we spend our money. The state of Texas, Montgomery County, wherever you are, is a household. And law enforcement is one thing. law enforcement may be braces, but guess what? Timmy also has to have a flu shot, right? So think globally about that. And do I believe that we need to take a hard look at how we spend money globally and think outside the box as far as how we can impact public safety? Absolutely. I'm willing to hold space for people that disagree, though.
So we've been at this for almost 2 hours. It's been fabulous conversation, but I think it's probably time to close the show down, so to speak. And we have a lot of the audience has stayed with us, which is great, but I know that we're running a little bit out of time. So I think it might be useful to have some closing remarks. So what do you think? You know, if you were to talk to the members of the audience and you were to say, what do you see for the future? And what kind of things can they go back when they go back home? Well, they are home, but when they're home and they're in work environments, what things can they do that would really make the world a better place and reduce racism? So I want to start with Kirk.
First, I want to thank the Law Center for the opportunity to participate in this panel, and thanks to my esteemed colleagues and fellow alumni. It's just been a pleasure, and I'm very honored to have this opportunity. I would say, as we go back to our homes and to our jobs, continue this conversation. Tiana and Richard Craig had excellent thoughts on allyship, and I think we should take that away and use it. Have those courageous conversations, have those vulnerable conversations with an end to understand and be understood, and with a common understanding that when you walk away, you're going to take concrete steps to change the conversation about racism, change how there is systemic racism that has not been broken down sufficiently, and figure out concrete steps in our local communities, also at the state and national level, that we can take to help make changes. Because if we don't act specifically at this moment in time, we will look back 5-10 years from now and it'll be a missed opportunity. I say we should also commit ourselves to doing more than tweeting or sending a thumbs up or sending an email. Commit to doing something concrete. I personally, I appreciate all the various emails and support that people send, but what I really want is to know, oh, I decided that I'm going to go sign up and take this class, or I'm reading this book, or I am going to help with voter registration. That, to me, is what's needed. That will make a difference. Or say, I'm going to go out and protest on X, Y, and Z on this particular date. That shows me that person is committed. They're truly trying to make a difference. And I will commit myself to do the same. I think actual concrete steps would be really important for us to change the current system of racism that is systemic. Continue to work through the issues of implicit bias that we all have. Call out folks when we see it and help them understand how it impacted us, and let them know we have our own and we want to work together to make a difference. So those are some of the things I would suggest that we take away from this as we go home.
Thank you. Tiana?
I always go back to not underestimating your ability to create a culture. Oftentimes, we add a weighted value to how much our environment can influence us, and we fail to commit ourselves to what it would look like if we committed ourselves to culture. And so what I would say is that when we are approaching this very, very difficult, intentional creation that devalues a specific community, devalues a specific act, anytime that this happens, right? We have to know that it is going to take our intention and our commitment to make it better. And so we have to stay in it. Because again, if it was only the group of the disparately impacted, we probably would be much further than we were. That's why it takes collective. So occupy the spaces that you are in. And I don't care where it is. It may only be your home, but any space that you have, that you occupy, influence that space, put the sweat equity in, ask yourself, how is it impacted by bias? How does it reinforce bias? What can I do to change that? Because every single one of us has a specific perspective and a specific voice that is not to be duplicated. And there is purpose and power in that, because you could be the one that comes up with a solution or communicates the message in a way that finally reaches someone who has never heard it before. Create spaces where people can be their authentic selves, not a watered down version, not a scared version, but say, in my space, everyone can be exactly who they are on their terms. And know that it's going to be hard, and know that, you know, we may not see it in our lifetime, but know that that transformative change is possible. Commit yourself to die trying, right? Really commit yourself to that work such that it is reflected in every fiber of your being. Everything you say, everything you do, how you spend your money. It's that ownership, and that ownership alone that is going to change the fabric that was created over 400 years ago. That's the only type of commitment. So get yourself to where you're ready to make that type of commitment.
Richard Craig. Thank you, Tiana.
First, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to be a part of the panel and tell my esteemed panelists, I don't think I was worthy to be on the panel with you. You guys were outstanding, so thank you so much. But I'm a firm believer that, if you show me your pocketbook, your checkbook, I can tell you what your values are. And it's not just a money issue, but it starts with being willing to make a financial investment in things that will make a difference, an organization that will make a difference. But then going beyond that, develop an open door policy. One of the things I do when we bring new associates to the firm is make sure they know, whether they're male, female, black, white, whatever, if you have an issue, my door is open, come in and talk to me. And I intentionally take them out because I want to hear where their world is, but let them hear where I'm coming from, because that reduces the amount of miscommunication, but begin to build a dialogue and a bridge between me and the associates. And I sometimes ask my white colleagues, when's the last time you went down the hall and took a black associate out in firms? And they're like, huh? I mean, because think about it, the associates probably aren't going to do it. So I think it's incumbent upon us as partners to reach out and force the issue and begin to see the world through their eyes, so I can also see the world through your eyes. And one of the things I do with a lot of this female associates have kids, and I'll say, look, when I was head of white collar group for one of my old firms, we had what I call the kids white collar group. What I meant by that is, I have to get work done, but I'm also sensitive to your home life experiences. So what do we need to do to arrange your work schedule so that you can balance your issues at home, but still produce a product that I need here? And so if you were to come to my office, you'd find all kind of kid toys in my office. Say, look, bring the kid back to the office. I have no problem with that, if that's what it takes to get it done. But what I like about my firm, where I'm at right now, I actually have uncomfortable conversations with my partners without any reservations, knowing that it's a safe place to have those conversations. We not always agree at the end of the day, but by and large, reasonable people can get to a reasonable place on issues if you have a dialogue about those issues. And, the firm has to think about what kind of culture do we want to have in the firm and what's good for business from a firm perspective, because the world is changing. Either you can get stuck where we're at now and do well for the next 5 or 10 years, or you can be a firm that progresses to do well for the next 25 or 30 years, understanding that as the country becomes browner, as there are more people of color in position of power, you need to have the ability to understand where they're coming from and make your place of work a place of environment that's comfortable for all people, all diversities, all races, so that we all can flourish. And if we start looking at the world from that point of view, I think it makes the world this an easier conversation to have with others to try to make necessary change. Because I have 3 A's. You have to have awareness about a problem. You have to acknowledge that something needs to be done about the problem. Then you have to take action to deal with the problem. If you get those 3 A's lined up through communication, you can make a big difference in society.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. They have been amazing, absolutely amazing, very, very talented, very, very smart, very, very interesting commentary. And what I find is that, it is important for us to have these conversations, that there are tough conversations, but they have to be authentic conversations among us to sort of understand the issues of race. That many times people think race is over. As was said, people thought, oh, we're post-racial once Obama was elected. And we see how untrue that was, that it seems like we've actually gone backwards in time after Obama was elected. And so it's really important for us to recognize that the seeds of racism are deep in our society, as was mentioned by the panelists. It's deep in our history. It's deep in so many of the organizations. It's deep in where people live. It's deep in where people go to school. It's deep where people work. It's deep in policing. It's deeply set in a lot of things. And so for many of us, and this panel especially, race was very a large part of their lives, that people had to overcome it, and they're amazingly successful, but in very white spaces. And that's the challenge, is that as a nation, it feels as though we've been stuck. We've been very much stuck. The conversation's been stuck. If we had the Civil War almost 150 years ago, it's not quite, but almost 150 years ago, and we're still debating some of the icons of the Civil War in 2020, that's an indication how stuck we've been in these issues. And so it's really important for us as a nation, as a state, as a city, as a community, as a law center, to have these conversations as a start, because people want action. You see this all over. People want action. They're tired of talk. But we have to have talk as a start, because as people have indicated, not everybody's in the same place, in terms, so you have to have a conversation so people are in the same place. But having these conversations and having a strategic plan for action will be able to overcome this pandemic, the pandemic of racism. We're all very familiar and concerned about the pandemic of the coronavirus, but we see over the past few weeks, this pandemic, how broad, how sweeping, how deep it is. But by working together and having these conversations and taking action, we can find our own solution, our own inoculation, to make sure that we put this virus to bed. So thank you so much to our audience. Thank you so much to Kirk Dobbins, Tiana Sanford, and Richard Craig Smith. Thank you so much to all of you. You've done a terrific job. Many thanks to Jeff Hoffman and Meredith Duncan for their leadership of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And many thanks for Sandra Tennessee, who's our Associate Dean for Community and Alumni Affairs. So this is calling it a night. Thank you so much for hanging in. Sorry we weren't able to get every question, but it's now over 2 hours. So I think that's more than enough of conversation. So have a good night all.